So if everybody can find their seats, we're going to start with the first presentation by Trevor Hadwen from AEFC. So he'll be joining us virtually and giving the 2022 Agro-Environmental Report. So go ahead, Trevor, when everything's all set up for you. Just a second, Trevor, we can't hear you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Just want to make sure I'm sharing my proper screen here. So just if you can see my screen, please let me know. I believe it's sharing the wrong one though. Just give me a quick second and I'll switch that over.
Yeah, we can see your desktop.
Okay, just get the presentation up there and we'll be set to go.
Yeah, we can see your slides now.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Trevor Hadwen. I work with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's National Agri-Climate Information Service, or what we call NACE. And it's a small group focused on science-based, near real-time monitoring and forecasting information and collecting the impacts of climate on agriculture across the country. I'm located in Regina, and I apologize for not being there today. I'd really like to be up there and join you in the full meeting, but I am unable to do so. It is great to have the opportunity to discuss the weather and climate conditions that Western Canada faced throughout the 2022 growing season. I'll be showing a lot of maps today throughout this talk, which will all be available publicly on the AFC Drought Watch website. And again, if you need any help, my name and contact information will be available at the end of the slide deck. Please don't hesitate to contact me. Okay, I'm going to begin looking back a little bit. Before we get going on the 22 drought or the 2022 season, I want to look back and provide a little bit of a reminder of the 2021 conditions that were still impacting us right now and certainly throughout the 2022 growing season. The 2021 drought was one of the most severe droughts recorded in intensity and extent in more than 50 years. Within Canada. According to the Canadian Drought Monitor assessment at the end of August, drought covered 94% of the agricultural land at the end of August last year. An extreme or exceptional drought, which are fairly rare in what we predict, covered over 28%. So that's a really expansive, really intense drought that is taking its time to recover in most areas. So that again, as we go through the 2022 season, that really has an impact on how we looked at things this past year. Of course, there was a little bit of precipitation in late August last year that improved the soil moisture going into winter, but not enough to really make that big of a difference. So going into the spring this year, there continued to be a lot of concern for drought through much of Western Canada. However, the spring drought conditions in BC and the Eastern Prairies were alleviated by high winter precipitation and tremendous spring precipitation. The map on the bottom left shows the precipitation through the spring season, and note those dark purple colors, exceptionally high, both in Manitoba, as well as eastern Saskatchewan and the northern portions of Alberta. that's really important to look at as we recovered from drought conditions, and also caused a lot of delays in seeding due to excess moisture. Combined with the wet conditions that we saw in some of those areas, we also saw really cold conditions right across the Western Canada. So the mean temperature difference from normal map there in the middle, May through, or for the entire month of May, shows the difference. And we're seeing 5 degrees below normal in southern Manitoba, southeastern Saskatchewan, and conditions improving a little bit, but mostly below normal right through the entire western portion of the country. Again, with the excess moisture in some of those areas and the cool conditions, we looked at seeding delays and certainly seeding development delays. In addition to some of those delays, we can see on the top right-hand side of the page here from our Agri-Climate Impact Reporters. So that's a group of volunteers that provide us with comments on a monthly basis. Our crop stage was more than 2 weeks delayed. Our feed production was recovering from the 21 drought, but slowly. We still had large areas with poor feed production, and pasture and rangeland conditions had not improved much at all in Alberta, southwestern Saskatchewan, and actually had switched from drought affected to flood affected in Manitoba. Looking at drought conditions for the spring conditions, we saw drought improve significantly in Western Canada throughout the winter and into the spring. The moisture in the early part of the spring quickly improved or eliminated the drought in southern Manitoba, which was impressive to say the least. Drought conditions, however, persisted and actually expanded in the early spring in southern Alberta until substantial rainfall helped improve those conditions in June, near the end of the spring season. So as of April, again, we're seeing 25% of the land covered by drought, which was a significant impact from the fall before. And then as we move through the season, we improved it continually, and we ended up with 16% of the agricultural land in drought as of the end of June, going into the summer period. Just highlighting that middle map again on the bottom there, showing June precipitation in Alberta, and that precipitation was so significant and life-saving for a lot of those producers in that region. It didn't rain. It was extremely dry prior to that event. We were discussing a lot of drought relief packages, putting those together, and then all of a sudden we got some significant rain, and that rain didn't last long. It turned off pretty quick, but that amount of rain really provided enough moisture to get the crop germinated, growth, and enough reserves to push it through the season despite the warm temperatures we'll see in a minute. Okay, as we went into the summer conditions, the conditions started to improve significantly. Warmer than normal temperatures allowed for most crops to advance nicely. However, delays were still noted by the crop development, as shown in at the end of July on the map on the right-hand side there. The map on the left side shows the temperature departures from normal. Again, we're highest in the west, with British Columbia and Alberta setting numerous heat records, both in July and August. For much of the region, for most regions in Western Canada, precipitation was above normal through the summer. As you can see in the middle map on the bottom there. Special attention should be noted for southern Alberta, where well above normal precipitation, again, quickly reduced the impacts of the previous drought, allowing for adequate moisture for crops through the season. Impacts were reported by producers at the end of July. Again, the delays in the crop stage, as well as feed production, continued to be a problem in that Western Saskatchewan region. And that Western Saskatchewan region continued to be the driest region of the prairies throughout the year. Just a really quick look at drought conditions as they improved through July and August through the growing season there. We were down to about 17% at the end of August. The low of the season was about 12% at the end of July. So August again started heating up a little bit and drying out as normal. But we ended up with the 17%. Looking at last year again, we were at 95% drought covered areas. So we're well below that area and a tremendous improvement for drought conditions right across the Prairie region this year. I did want to throw in a quick map here from our Canadian crop metric program. It's showing favorable conditions as of the end of August for much of Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan for canola. Note that yellow area around north of Brandon, Dauphin, Yorkton area. That area was continuously the worst through the year in terms of our crop condition assessments in terms of canola production. So that showed below average production right from the beginning of the year. And if you're looking for where those products can be found and where you can do some exploring, our crop metrics program on our Drought Watch website is where that's located. Okay, as we went into the fall, we returned to well above normal temperatures. Again, that map at the bottom left, we're seeing mean temperatures of 4 to 5 degrees above normal throughout October, which is extremely warm when you have 5 degrees above normal in any month, but especially for the fall period there. Again, providing really good harvest conditions and drying conditions for most regions, but also causing some concerns in some crops, including canola. Looking at the conditions in the middle, the precipitation, again, we're returning to a drier pattern, especially for the northern prairies throughout the fall period. So again, some extremely low precipitation in the Vegreville, Lloydminster region, and quite a bit throughout central Alberta and Saskatchewan. The volunteer crop reporters that we have also continue to report below normal crop stage, or 2 weeks behind in the darker areas on that upper right map here. Feed production issues, again, were showing up a little bit more than they did throughout the summer, but still decent in most areas, a couple areas of concern. And pasture conditions, again, along that Alberta-Saskatchewan border region, really poor pasture conditions. They just did not recover from the 2021 drought, and certainly didn't recover with the rainfall that we did receive in those areas. It just was too little, too infrequent throughout the summer period. As we look at drought conditions going into the fall, you'll notice that drought is creeping up again. We have, as of end of October, 50% of the region covered by drought. So again, from 17% at the end of August, now up to 50%. We are just working on the November assessment, and it will be released hopefully this week. But we're noticing a small amount of change throughout this time period. Specifically, if you look here at the November precipitation map on the bottom middle, it does show quite a bit of rainfall in November, but we have to note that there's only 20 mils as a normal precipitation for that period. So we're not making up a whole lot of the deficits that we accumulated through the late summer and early fall. I believe this is my last slide here, showing our current conditions and drought outlook. So I'll start with the current conditions on the right-hand side. The first map on the top is a Palmer Drought Indice map. It kind of shows a little bit longer term conditions. So darker colors are drier than the lighter colors or the blues. So we've got very dry conditions still in large portions of the Prairie region as we head into the winter here. And we will need significant moisture in those areas next spring to really remove those concerns from the agricultural point of view. The modeled soil moisture below it, again, highlights that whole dry area of the northern prairies, really starting to dry out as we move through the fall period. There is some hope, though. Our 30-day drought outlook provides a little bit of optimism. It looks like there will be the greens is drought removal and the yellows is improvement. So we are looking at fairly significant improvement throughout Saskatchewan, throughout the remainder of the calendar year here. So hopefully that remains true. This product relies heavily on the Environment Canada 30-day forecasts of precipitation and temperature, which are fairly accurate. Anything more than 30 days becomes a little bit problematic when we start to model it. So the biggest concern that I have right now looking at this drought map is we're not seeing a whole lot of improvement in that Edmonton region and that central Alberta. And that's the area that's been kind of the driest area as we move through the past couple of years, especially the last 12 months. So a little bit of concern still remains there. And I think I'll leave it at that. I know that was a whirlwind through the climate cycle for the year, but if you do have any questions, certainly feel free to email me. Again, my email address is on the website there at Trevor Hadwen at agr.gc.ca, or you can just take a look at our Drought Watch website, again at www.agr.gc.ca/drought. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks a lot, Trevor. And our next speaker is Véronique Barthet from Canadian Grain Commission, and she'll be giving a report on the quality of the 2022 Western Canadian canola crop.
How does it work? It's actually pretty great to have weather environment, because this is what is impacting the quality of the crop, and it's going to save some time on the presentation. So as a resume of the growing season, too much water in some area, not enough water in other, and sometime when you had precipitation, there was thunderstorm with heavy rain that didn't actually do anything good for the crop. Last year, one of the most important map of the presentation was actually the number of the over 30s. So I still have that map on the presentation, but where the day over 30 was all over the prairie last year, this year is really concentrated in south of Alberta and southwest of Saskatchewan. And the rest of the prairie actually was pretty nice. Okay, there was the spotlight. No, I didn't. Just want to change. How do you change the next slide? It's suddenly not working. I'm going backwards, and now I'm going front. Okay, what I think was the most important this year was actually the drought map when you look in the weather condition, because I had the one in May and I had the one at the end of the season, because the one in May, even if you seed in May and there is no water, nothing is going to grow. So May is quite important because you look at what's going to be the moisture in the soil to be able to have the seed that you've been actually putting in the soil to develop and grow. So whatever was seeded in May had a hard time to grow because there was no water in a lot of the things, except if you were in Manitoba, because actually it was so much water that you couldn't go anywhere. And then end of August, that's also the drought map, because it looked at what kind of precipitation we had this year during the season. And even if there is some improvement to precipitation, there was still missing water in some of the area. And this lack of water, for me, is affecting the quality of the crop. So I use a lot of the crop report from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. And this is a lot of information to look at weather and how the crop is developing over the season. And when I got those data, actually, I made a graph to look at what is seeded, because the timing of the seeding and the timing of the harvest is also indicating how the crop is going to do. So actually, Manitoba was about 4 weeks behind because of the water, and the time in seeding of Saskatchewan was a bit delayed, but not that much. And the one of Alberta was a pretty on time compared to last year. And when you have delay seeding, you have delay harvesting. That's what you see in Manitoba. And actually about 1 week, the harvest stopped in Manitoba because we had a lot of rain. So that's the reason why you have the bar that's almost stopped and go back again. And behold, Manitoba, which is usually the first to be finished harvest, was the last one this year, and finished end of October. So that was quite interesting because the first sample we have, it's usually Manitoba. The first 50 samples we had this year were from southwest of Saskatchewan. And that was very strange for us. So sample, we behind in the number of samples that we have for the harvest survey this year. We're behind for all the crop. We don't really know why, but we put an ad in the news, and we're going to accept sample until December 31st. And so anybody that has still forgot to send the envelope, please do. You have about a month to do it now, a bit less than a month, but you have. And coming back, those data are used for a lot of things, but they're also used for research, because this is the data that I provide to Rob to look at some of the data and the analysis. And we ask a couple of questions like the variety, when did you seed, then we do harvest. And this is important when you look at data, and then you might want to look at the effect on the environment actually on the crop. So a bit less sample than last year, but we're still able to do some analysis. One of the comments we had actually, it's people didn't send the samples because it was a good harvest. 94% of the sample were graded number 1. And a lot of people, when they have number 1 sample, they feel that they don't need to send it to the Grain Commission because they say, oh, well, I have number 1, and that's it. But actually, the fact that you have number 1, it's for the grade, but doesn't need anything for the rest of the quality of the sample. So pretty good harvest this year, number 1. One of the main reasons, the gentleman before were talking about the good weather in October. We didn't have cold weather. We had a killing frost at one point, but it was quite late in the season. So no killing frost, good weather mean no green seed. No green seed means number 1 normally. And so that's what happened. When we talk about the oil, everybody was surprised actually when I'm presenting a 42% oil, 42.6, 42.7, which is way lower than the 10-year average or even the 5-year average, but it's higher than last year. And one of the interesting things actually, 34.9, that was the lowest oil content we had this year, and it was part of the 50 sample that we had from southwest of Manitoba, southwest of Saskatchewan. So big difference in the distribution of the sample, big difference in the distribution of the oil on the sample. And the first couple of samples we had, we were thinking actually the instrument were not working because they were so low in oil. So this is the kind of historic data, 10-year average. The oil content recovered compared to last year, because last year was such an extreme condition with the drought plus the number of days over 30 was extreme in all the prairies, and we didn't have that. So that's the reason why the oil recovered a bit, but it didn't recover that much because we're still higher than normal in temperature, we're still low in moisture, and that was the reflect on the oil. I will argue actually with some of the data that was presented by Rob, because the last time we had a drought, a very big drought, was 2002. And I think that some of the data that was used from the spot plot or even data from the CGC didn't use any of the data from 2002. So it's kind of difficult to really see the effect of the lack of moisture on the crop. But I kind of look at the distribution on the oil content. And what I saw actually, that if you look at the southwest of Saskatchewan, this is where you find the lowest oil content from everywhere for the average. And the second one is actually the south of Alberta. So south of Alberta, southwest of Saskatchewan was harvested by mid-September. Everything was harvested. And this is where you find the lowest oil content. So coming back, oil content, protein, the protein content is higher than last year, which is okay because actually you have a lower, or still protein content is lower than last year because you have a higher oil content, and that's kind of the average that you see. And actually when this is the protein content flap, so you flip it on the other side, you have the oil content, you know, one is the other one, which is a pretty good for the meal because you will have good quality protein for your meal, whatever you do. Glucosinolates, actually that's an interesting part this year. Canola is supposed to be less than 30 micromole glucosinolates in meal. And what we saw for the last 2 years, that was hot and dry, there is a tendency of some of the variety actually to produce higher glucosinolates. And there is paper in Australia that show actually when you have the canola in dry condition, your glucosinolate content is going to go higher. And that's what we saw this year, and a bit less than last year, but we saw it last year also. That doesn't impact the overall average, which is still pretty good, you know, between 10 to 11 or 12 in the highest in the last 20 years. So pretty good average for glucosinolate content. And chlorophyll, as I mentioned earlier, we had a very nice season, very nice long season for harvest. So no issue with chlorophyll whatsoever. Very good average. There won't be a problem for any of the crusher, won't be a problem for any of the exporter, which is actually pretty good. And again, low chlorophyll over the years doesn't reflect an effect of the genetic, reflects an effect of the environment. For the last couple of years, we haven't had a frost in September, and this is what it shows. Alpha-linolenic acid. So alpha-linolenic acid, it's a variety effect, is going lower and lower. So lower than the 5-year average or the 10-year average. Something that was quite interesting actually is usually when you look at the range, the highest alpha-linolenic content is coming from the Peace River, is coming from Alberta. That's not the case this year. Some of the highest range is coming from Saskatchewan, and probably because southeast of Saskatchewan and the northeast of Saskatchewan was kind of more cooler and had more water than you had in the Peace River or even in Alberta. And again, the historic is showing that you're getting lower and lower in your alpha-linolenic acid. So you have a balanced alpha-linolenic acid or oleic acid. If the alpha-linolenic acid is lower, then you have higher oleic acid, and that's what we see this year. And yeah, it's getting higher, and as you can see, it's higher than the 5-year or the 10-year average. And again, this is completely the opposite of alpha-linolenic acid, and this is genetic effect where you see the slide of the slope of the oleic acid, you know, over the years going up. Iodine value represent the total and saturation of the oil, so it's oleic, alpha-linolenic, and linoleic acid, C18-1, 82, 83, but the one that has the most effect actually the C18-3. Alpha-linolenic acid. So if you have a lower content of alpha-linolenic acid, you're going to have a lower iodine value, and this is what we see here. And again, interesting for us, Alberta has a lower iodine value than Saskatchewan, and that's all related to the alpha-linolenic content. And again, you see that iodine value is going lower over the years, and that's a genetic effect. So this is basically overall quality of the crop. We still, as I say, missing samples. We're missing, you know, 300-400 samples compared to last year. Is it going to change the data? No, because it's probably what we have enough sample, enough representation of the sample to have a good representation of the data. So what we saw, the last samples that were coming in actually were the ones showing the lowest grade. So there is a tendency to a more lowest grade in the last 500 sample that we had than the 500 sample we got at the beginning. What we saw, the most degrading factor actually was not grain seed, was oxidized seed, orange seed, brown seed. And I was showing, and that's probably related to the stress and the lack of moisture and the heat stress that the seed had. We saw some of it also in Manitoba, and that's not related to heat, that was related to too much moisture. And basically, that's the end of the presentation. This is the website where you can find all the data. And we tend to publish during the harvest season. As soon as we have 500 samples, we put it on the web and then we update every week. And this is all the people that involved into the harvest survey and produce the data. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Véronique. Our next speaker is Cory Jacob from the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, and he's giving a report on the 2022 canola production report for the Prairies.
Excellent. Kate, perfect. Thank you very much for the introduction, Doug. All right, so as Doug said, my name is Cory Jacob. I'm the provincial oilseed specialist with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. I'm very happy that I was asked to present here. I'm also hoping that my voice holds out. I had some trouble sleeping last night, and I think I sawed about a cord of wood in my sleep, so we'll see how things go here. But anyway, so I'm going to give a production summary for Alberta, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan for canola for 2022. So to start with Alberta, we had about 6.5 million acres seeded to canola, about a 2.5% decrease from 2021, and about a 1.1% increase from the 5-year average. A 41.7 bushel an acre average yield, which was 44.1% above 2021's yield, again, due to that drought, and about 8.7% above the 5-year average. We saw about 6 million metric tons of production, which is about 31.9% of Canada's canola production. And that's about a 40.3% increase from 2021 and about 10% above the 5-year average. Moving into Saskatchewan, we had about 11.3 million acres seeded to canola, down about 4.9% from 2021 and down about 5.3% from the 5-year average. The average yield was about 37.8 bushels an acre, about 51% above the yield in 2021, again, due to that drought situation, as well about 0.8% below the 5-year average. We had about 9.6 million metric tons of production, which is about 50.8% of Canada's canola production, and about a 43.5% change or above the 2021 production, and about 6.3% below the 5-year average. And then moving east to our neighbors in Manitoba, we saw about 3.3 million acres seeded to canola, about 3.6% below the numbers in 2021, and about 1.3% below the 5-year average. A 42.5 bushel an acre average yield, which is pretty decent given the year. And that's about 30% above the yield from the previous year in 2021 and about 4.5% above the 5-year average. About 3.1 million metric tons of production, which rounds out about 16.5% of Canada's canola production. And that was 25% above from 2021 and then about 3.2% change from the 5-year average. So when we go through some growing conditions in May, as our previous speakers had mentioned, we had very, very wet conditions that delayed seeding, especially in eastern Saskatchewan and Manitoba and the Peace region of Alberta. Western Saskatchewan and a good portion of Alberta were on the drier side. Definitely some reports of staggered emergence or emergence issues. I pulled a lot of this data from the Prairie crop reports, so it's hard to get sometimes you have some localized or some more generalized reports. As well, there were noted significant frosts, I believe about mid-May for 2 weeks in a row. So again, some assessment of the damage from that, and as well, quite a fair bit of flea beetle pressure. So again, assessing the damage and the control measures needed or seeding. So this map is from the Manitoba Agricultural Services Corporation. So this is kind of their crop insurance equivalent to Saskatchewan. So this basically is kind of the variety acreage comparison for the top 10 canola varieties grown in Manitoba. This is based on 3.2 million acres seeded and reported to the office. So on the y-axis, you have the acres, the x-axis is the hybrid. So we can see the far majority of acres went to L340 PC and L233P. And then we go way down and we see L345 PC, L357P, L255 PC, and then L356 PC, then moving down to DKLL 82SC, L258 HPC, P505 MSL, and 1028 RR to round out the acres for the top 10 varieties grown in Manitoba in 2022. Noting the top 6 varieties are the Invigor Liberty Link production system, so that has quite a stronghold for acres in Manitoba. So, and then rounding out the Bayer line, the Pioneer, and the Brevant as well systems. So continued growing conditions in June, we see seeding complete in a lot of those areas that were too wet. So eastern Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the Peace region of Alberta. As mentioned by some other speakers, some timely rains in Insular and Alberta that did help with the moisture situation. The western part of Saskatchewan stayed quite dry. I had read in some of the crop reports we did have a heat wave partway through the month. And as well, the late seeded crops behind, so having some issues with that. As well, I would probably note too, again, continued flea beetle pressure on those later crops. Moving into July, the dry conditions in most of Alberta and western Saskatchewan kind of persisting. As we also noted, the temperatures were quite warm for the growing season. Kind of a year of extremes where we saw extremes from drowned out to excess moisture to extremely dry conditions where we had crops pretty much being written off or producing very little yield. As well, in the Manitoba crop report, I read quite a diverse stage of canola crops where we had crops being reported, in July that were only at the 4 leaf stage of their development, and some that were lucky to be seeded earlier that were at 50% bloom. So again, management implications and some issues for producers with that. And of course, also in July, continued rain in Manitoba. I believe the crop report stated 2022 was one of the wettest years on record for Manitoba. Moving on into kind of the fall and harvest conditions, there was a good start to harvest where the conditions were more dry. Continued very wet in Manitoba and eastern Saskatchewan. There was, in the Alberta crop report, there were some very good yields predicted in certain areas. They seem to use an index system, and some areas were reporting about 1.05, maybe 1.1, so 5 or 10% above their long-term average yield index. And I think I kind of alluded to or showed that with the production summary earlier on, where they had some relatively strong yields and above the 5-year average as well. Now, my counterpart in Manitoba, Dane Fraze, he sent me this photo, which is showing some lodged crops. There was quite a fair bit of heavy rain and wind that lodged a number of crops in Manitoba. So producers were dealing with some more challenging conditions and dealing, a little bit of extra management needed to help that crop along when it comes time for harvest. But the majority of crops, especially in eastern Saskatchewan and Manitoba, being behind in their growth stage. Still, as the previous speakers had mentioned, the crops did come off. We didn't leave any crop over winter, just a lot of harvest took place later on into October for those wetter areas, and then of course coming off in good condition in those drier areas where they could get at harvest a lot earlier. And I'm just going to end with this slide. I know Mr. Hadwen had as well shown it, but just on the left, you have the Canadian Drought Monitor, kind of where we were in the spring. So we were, anywhere from abnormally dry to a moderate to severe drought across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and parts of British Columbia as well. And we did have some varying rain throughout the growing season and some relief, but then, as of course had noted by Mr. Hadwen, that we did go backwards with some drier fall conditions. And as of Halloween, kind of going into fall freeze up, we were seeing, again, abnormally dry, moderate to severe drought-like conditions across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, and even moving west into British Columbia. So hoping that we can get some good snowfall, even though snow doesn't account for a lot of our moisture, but maybe we'll get some optimism back. But really we need some some good timely rains next growing season, hopefully early on to kind of get us out of the drought conditions and bring back some optimism, because it has been a tough year for certain producers and other ones have fared a lot better. So I've got a minute left in my presentation, but that's all I've got. So thank you.
All right, thanks a lot, Cory. And our next speaker is Alireza Akhavan, also from the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, and he's going to give a report on the Prairie disease report.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Doug, for introduction. So my name is Alireza, as Doug said, and I am the provincial plant disease specialist with Ministry of Agriculture in Saskatchewan. So for information from Alberta and Manitoba, I am relying on my counterparts, Dr. Michael Harding from Alberta Agriculture, and my colleague is David Kaminsky and Youngmin Kim from Manitoba. I am giving you a snapshot of what we observed during the growing season in terms of diseases on canola, kind of prairie-wise, but my focus is a little bit biased on Saskatchewan. So we start from Sclerotinia stem rot, the disease that we kind of were hardly able to find last year due to drought. Just an overview of what was seen in Alberta, the prevalence was 46%. And again, just a refresh in terms of terminology, prevalence is the number of crops with disease, and incidence is the number of plants in each crop with disease, and severity is the proportion of the plant with disease. So 46% of the crops in Alberta had Sclerotinia stem rot, at least at trace level, with 3% incidence. And also because the survey in Alberta is just assessing the lower main stem, so we don't have a severity from Alberta for Sclerotinia stem rot. But in Saskatchewan, almost 56% of the fields had Sclerotinia stem rot this year with 6% incidence, so much higher than last year with severity of 0.2 on a scale of 1 to 5. And Manitoba had 41% of the crops with Sclerotinia stem rot, 2.5% incidence, and 1.2 out of 5 the severity for Sclerotinia stem rot. So this graph compares average incidence of, so this is for Saskatchewan, and the graph compares average incidence of Sclerotinia stem rot seen this year back to previous years dating back to 1999, based on the data we have from the general Canola disease survey here. And the graph clearly shows how dependent this specific disease is on environmental conditions, especially on moisture. So if you look at this, in 2016, the disease got a peak at 24%, and that was a very wet year, and then dropped significantly in 2017, which was a very dry year, to 3% incidence, and then started to increase again, stayed at 17% in 2020, and then dramatically dropped last year to 2%, because it was a very dry year. And again, this year raised to 6%, so almost 3 times more than what we saw last year for Sclerotinia. So this one is a regional breakdown of Sclerotinia prevalence and incidence from this year's survey in the province. And prevalence was highest in the northeast region, with almost 78%, and the lowest in the southwest region, 4%. And if we looked at all those reports from previous speakers on weather, we'll see how well aligned this with the weather pattern. So incidence was highest in the East Central region with 11% and lowest in the West Central and Southwest region with almost 2%. So very well aligned with the pattern we got from the moisture from other speakers. So moving to another very important disease, blackleg. Blackleg was seen practically in every field which was assessed in Alberta, so almost 99%, with high incidence 27%, but quite low severity 0.5 in a scale of 1 to 5. Saskatchewan, we had the blackleg frequently found 73%, and we saw the incidence of 11%, so quite high, but again quite low severity of 0.2 on a 1 to 5 scale. Manitoba had 85% of the crops with blackleg and with incidence of 13% and higher severity compared to the other two provinces at 1.2. So again, this graph is a comparison of blackleg incidence that was seen this year compared to previous years going back to 2012. Overall, there had been an increase in blackleg being seen in province between 2012 till 2020. Incidence was high in 2020 at almost 15% and decreased last year to 7%, and again increased this year back to 11%. Regional breakdown of blackleg prevalence incidence from Saskatchewan. The East Central had the highest amount of blackleg with 85% prevalence. Southeast and Northwest had the highest incidence, and Northeast had both the lowest prevalence and the lowest incidence. So moving to the hot topic of the day is verticillium stripe. One of the concerns we hear a lot from producers. So in Alberta, 2% of the crops had verticillium samples with low incidence of 0.004%. In Saskatchewan, none confirmed through the general canola disease survey, but this year, because of the sensitivity around this, we had two surveys. The second one was verticillium specific survey after swath or after harvest. And it was a targeted survey. So we were there to find it. We targeted fields that we thought we may find verticillium. We looked at 25 fields, and in 16 fields, we had the verticillium. So 64% of those fields had verticillium with quite high incidence of 10%. Again, by no means these are representative for the whole province, as it was a targeted survey. Manitoba had frequent finding of verticillium. 38% of the crops had verticillium with 9% incidence. So quite high amount of verticillium stripe in Manitoba. So last year was the very first year that we officially we actually confirmed the presence of verticillium with visible signs in province, so with visible microsclerotia in the field. And so this was the first confirmed report. I know some people saw that in the past, but it was the first confirmed report from Saskatchewan of seeing the pathogen with visible signs, which are those tiny black microsclerotia. Unfortunately, even though that we had a very small sample size, we got 2 new lineages first time from Canada. So we have all the 3 lineages from Saskatchewan, while in Manitoba, even though we have lots of verticillium, they come from 1 lineage. So this is the targeted survey we had this year. We targeted the eastern side of the province due to the proximity to Manitoba and some infected fields there and some other criteria. We believed that we have a high likelihood of finding verticillium, and this was after harvest. So each color is one surveyor that we went to eastern side of the province after harvest and collected samples, looked at the samples, and got the data. So this is a big patch of verticillium in eastern side of the province that we had the training for surveyors happening there. On that patch of a crop of 4 years back-to-back canola, we had verticillium side by side by blackleg and gray stem and sclerotinia. So it was kind of a disease classroom for surveyors to compare diseases right at the same field, short rotation. And again, the numbers I told you, 64% prevalence among those 25 crops with 10% overall incidence. We had a field with 64% of incidence of verticillium in that field. So this 10% overall incidence average across all the 25 fields. But again, these numbers are by no means representative for Saskatchewan because it was a targeted survey. We will see what we want to do next year. Again, during the general canola disease survey, we didn't find any. So we will see what approach is best for us next year. So this slide is only for Manitoba. My counterpart, David Kaminsky, put together one slide to show the percent prevalence trend for Manitoba. And as see on a Sclerotinia stem rot, we will see that how dependent Sclerotinia stem rot is on weather, especially moisture. In Manitoba, there was just an increasing trend for blackleg and verticillium for both of them. And of course, for a specific interest on verticillium, we will see that every year it just adds to it. So clarbroot, I will be very quick. Of course, it's frequently found in Alberta, so 10% of the crops had clarbroot, 1% incidence, quite severity, low severity of 0.02. Manitoba, no new symptomatic cases from the survey, only 2 from out of survey, and 31 soil samples are under investigation. Saskatchewan has a comprehensive clarbroot program. It has multiple pillars or components, but because it's a declared pest in Saskatchewan, the results will be released through a special approval procedure, and we will have the results available the first week of January during the crop production show, and then together with SaskCanola, we release the information and the new map. The new map is being generated right now. And just very overall, we looked at 520 fields altogether from all the different components of the program. And again, the map will be available the first week of January, and SaskCanola will release it, I guess, before or after AGM. So just very quick look at the other 2 diseases that only Saskatchewan and Manitoba do survey for. Aster yellows was found in almost 4% in 4% of crops in each of the province. Foot rot only 4% for Saskatchewan, and Alternaria black spot 51% and 70% for Saskatchewan and Manitoba respectively. And thank you very much. I got 1 minute over time. Sorry for that. I tried to be very quick.
All right, thanks, Alireza. And our next speaker is Meghan Vankosky from AAFC Saskatoon to give us a report on insects in canola in 2022 and the look ahead to the next season. So this is a virtual presentation.
Thanks, Doug, for the introduction. I'm sorry about my terrible lighting because the sun is setting more quickly than I thought it would, but I will get my presentation pulled up here and then we don't have to see me anymore. So I'm thankful for being invited to come and speak to you about insect pests and crops. And sorry, I'm just gonna stop my video here so you can just hopefully see my slides. So I'm going to just talk quickly about insect pests in canola in 2022 and what we're kind of looking forward to in 2023. I will not belabor the point about weather because it's been discussed already quite a few times, but things were a little bit better in 2022 as compared to 21. So for those of you who don't know me, I am the chair of the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network, and our group conducts annual monitoring of several different canola pests that are listed here. And you can see the distribution of our sampling sites shown in the map here. So we'd like to thank all of the volunteers who contributed to our various pest monitoring programs in 2022. These could have been field visits, but also include people who have very kindly hosted pheromone traps and reported information back to us. So you can go to our website here in the link for more information about the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network and what we do and the different insects that we survey. Okay, so I'm going to kind of start with the bad news and maybe hopefully move to the good news. Grasshopper densities were quite high in 2022, especially further south towards the US border. I was out to collect some samples towards the end of the summer, and the further south I drove, heading all the way down to the border, the thicker the grasshoppers got on the ground. So we do expect that grasshoppers could be a problem into 2023 because we did see these large populations in the fall. So something to keep in mind, canola is not always the favorite food of the grasshopper, but grasshoppers will definitely eat canola when given the opportunity or when they don't have many other foods to choose from. Diamondback moth were a little bit of a concern in some areas across the prairies in 2022. We did see quite small populations or quite small trap captures in the pheromone traps, but we don't use the pheromone traps to determine what the risk is. We use those to determine when the populations are arriving or migrating into Canada from the United States and other areas. So I think it's important to keep in mind that diamondback moth have a very short generation time. And so the warmer it is, the faster the population growth is, and the more likely a localized outbreak is to occur. So it's really important to scout, and you can follow along with our predictions on the number of generations of diamondback moth that could occur by following along with our Prairie Pest Monitoring Network weekly updates. So in 2022, by the end of the season, we were looking at definitely 4 generations of diamondback moth, which probably contributed to some of the local outbreaks that we did have reported. Into better news, populations of Bertha armyworm have remained quite low over the last number of years, kind of contrary to our expectations. We've kind of been waiting for a Bertha armyworm outbreak since I moved to Saskatoon in 2016 to start my job with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So this is the map from the 2021 survey. The 2022 survey map is not quite ready to be posted, but what we saw in 2022 was quite similar to last year, with a few pockets where numbers were a little bit higher, but generally the numbers were quite low, and the risk due to Bertha to canola was also quite low. Our cabbage seed pod weevil survey, we're almost done processing the samples from 2022, but you can see kind of what's happened in the last few years with the populations contracting a little bit towards the south and remaining higher in the southwest, so especially into southern Alberta and parts of Saskatchewan. We've really seen a fairly similar trend happening in 2022. And again, the map for Saskatchewan will be ready for the crop production show in January. We do now know that there are cabbage seed pod weevil in Manitoba, and John Gavlosky has done some monitoring there as well. But so far as we know, there are no populations into the Peace River region. So that's a good news story for people who are growing canola up in northern Alberta and BC. We've been doing some work on canola flower midge ever since we identified it as a pest on the prairies. We haven't conducted a survey, a formal survey, since 2019, but we've been out in the fields, and so we've been watching for it this whole time, and the numbers seem to still be most concentrated in the south or in the northeast of Saskatchewan, as you can see in the map here, where it's a little bit more red and yellow. We have also had these reports of larvae found in the pods. We had a few more of those this year. We do expect that it's because the pods have been damaged before the midge try to lay eggs in them, and it's not that the adults can actually lay eggs into the pods, but we're still investigating that. But I think this is just something that it's good to be aware of, that they're pretty widespread, but in pretty low numbers across most of the prairies. Of course, flea beetles are a really big story from 2022. The picture that I've got here of some broccoli plants just shows some of the late season feeding damage that we were seeing. around outlook, mostly from crucifer flea beetles. It's a striped flea beetle in the picture. So of course, we did have reports of spraying across the prairies, and the new generation adults caused some problems later on in the season. We don't monitor for the flea beetle in the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network. This species poses some pretty major hurdles for us in terms of monitoring them in a timely manner. But we do recognize that they are a problem, and there are a number of different research projects across the prairies right now that are focused on trying to figure out what we should be doing with flea beetles. So to quickly wrap up, looking forward to 2023, it's really going to be location dependent. Please watch for our Prairie Pest Monitoring Network maps and the maps posted by the provincial entomologists. These will give you some idea of what to watch for in your region, but of course the maps do not replace people going out and scouting their fields in person. That's really important. It's also very weather dependent. So we do expect grasshoppers to be a problem, for example, but if it becomes really wet and cool next spring, that could really turn that around and grasshoppers might not be such a risk. So all of these different factors need to be considered when we're thinking about the potential risk into 2023. Also, if you're in Saskatchewan and you're interested in having us come out to your fields to monitor for different insects, we would really appreciate those volunteers. And there's some information here on the slide for how to volunteer your land so that we can come out and monitor for different insect pests, which we really appreciate. So thanks so much. I'd just like to acknowledge the sources of information for this presentation and the funding for the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network and the invitation to be here. Thanks so much.
All right, thanks, Meghan, for that summary. And our last speaker for this part of the session is Raymond Gadoua. So he'll be giving a summary of the 2022 WCC RRC Canola Recommendation Trials Report. And then so after Raymond's talk, we'll bring all the speakers so far for this session up for a Q&A session.
Hopefully this has an age-adjusted timer on it, but anyways. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for hanging in there for the afternoon, and it's a pleasure to meet you today and report on behalf of the Canola Council of Canada and the Western Canada Canola Rapeseed Recommending Committee. I am the corporate secretary of the WCCRC, and I also fill a consultative role on their behalf, working in tandem with the Canola Council of Canada to provide recommendation services for the purposes of recommending canola across Western Canada. This is just and my apologies, very small writing, but I think I'm joining a club of small writing. So this is just gives you an organizational representation of the components of the WCCRC. So it's has quite a broad representation of the canola industry in general. From all the way from producers to exporters, the Canola Council of Canada, of course, and specialists in pathology and quality. The WCCRC operations are fully funded by entry fees, by those companies bringing their entries forward for recommendation. So it's, as I said, it's a nonprofit, but fully funded by entry fees. So in essence, a kind of a small business. This is just a representation of canola variety recommendation trials, and in essence, the purpose of those trials are to evaluate canola cultivars for the purposes of recommendation, and ultimately this is what makes it into the marketplace. 99% of the this is changing spontaneously, but anyways, 99% of the acreage in Canada is probably flows through the system, and I'm not sure why this is moving, but How do I go backwards here? Okay. Here we go. So this is an overview of this year's testing. So testing, we have testing of first-year entries and second-year entries concurrently. So the entries that are in the trials this year will be in the 2023 trials. And I'm going to have to go backwards again. So this is just an overview of the first year, total of 131 locations across Western Canada. Total number of trials are 1278. That gives you the distribution across provinces. We haven't had trials in BC for 2 years now. And then the second portion is basically the reductive approach when companies make their decisions and put fewer entries into the public co-op trials. So we had a total of 71 trials across Western Canada and 24 Black Leg disease reaction trials. And this is the data is coalesced into a recommendation sheet. So it involves an extremely large data set that is all coalesced from all these first-year entries and second-year entries. And this is the evaluation sheet that's prepared on the basis of oil, protein, fatty acid, glucosinolates, and of course erucic acid, which obviously is a undesirable fatty acid unless you're a high erucic specialty canola or specialty rapeseed. Excuse me. So I've had some questions this fall, and they said, Ray, what the heck are the WCC zones? What do they mean? So I thought I would put it up here, what the zones mean when you're entering zones. And these zones were originally drawn up, I think, by John Capcara and his colleagues, and some beer and rye might have been involved. But this is just a rough idea of what those zones are, and of course with global warming and so on, they've changed over the years. So I don't want to belabor you with reading that all out, but hopefully you can read it there, and if you're not in concurrence with that, then certainly welcome for commentary. But this is something I put together several years ago based on my conversations with industry colleagues and looking at a number of maps and so on. So it certainly could be realigned based on more information. So this is a rough map of that printed representation, and again, it's very loose and changing with obviously weather conditions. The only solid feature about the zones is if you're a gray wooded or Luvasol, that's a guaranteed short season zone, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So getting back to the first year testing and where that distribution into zones, you can see this is how this is based on this year's testing, and that's where the it's not supposed to do that. That's where the first year private testing, those roughly 1,000 or more trials were distributed across Western Canada. And it's not untypical to see Manitoba kind of over-representative with respect to its actual acreage. It's just being a function of the testing system for going back a long time. There tends to be, proportionally, more trials in Manitoba, for instance, as compared to Alberta. And this is the allocation of this year's trials, which are of course parsed down. And you can see Highway 2 is a very popular in Alberta is a very popular place to place trials. Pardon me. So I'd like to take the opportunity to fully recognize the cooperators of second-year testing, and most of these are involved with first year's testing. So AFC, Saskatoon, AgQuest, BASF, Bayer Crop Science, Cargill, DL Seeds, ICMS, Innotech Alberta, Mackenzie Applied Research Association, Nutrien Ag Solutions, Pioneer Hybrids, Corteva / Pioneer Hybrid Production. My apologies to the Corteva people. And the University of Manitoba. The second year testing would be impossible without their participation. So an acknowledgement of their contributions, not just this year, but over the years. And this is just an overview of the entrants in the second year testing of this year, and the herbicide tolerance attributes that were given to us when they entered the co-op trials. So some give us common names when they enter, and others give us their commercial names. But all of these naming attributes are, we make sure that we have the full understanding of the genetic constructs that are involved with them. Skip forward, and of course I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the contributions of the Grain Research Laboratory, Véronique, Barthet, and her professional staff have been instrumental in maintaining the integrity of the recommendation system, going back to and before maybe Jim Don's day. So a full recognition for them. It's so pivotal that quality information is what defines canola for Canada. And for the marketplace and in Canada, in the world. So acknowledgement of their contribution. I've got 27 seconds left. So I think that might be the last slide. Okay, here we go, 20 seconds. So this is just relating back to some of the discussions about environment on quality, and it's a little bit unrelated to canola recommendation system per se, but it's just for informational purposes. And you can see the big difference between a high yield site and a low yield site. And if you just look at the inverse of the oil and protein values at the Elstow, Saskatchewan site and the Edmonton site, it just goes to show you the impact of environment on quality. These 168 samples from each site were the same genetic comparison. So it really shows you the environmental component. So with that, I'd like to. I'd be remiss if I forgot Cheryl Kiefer, who's been an assistant to myself for 25 years and works out of the Saskatoon office. So full thanks to her and watching my back and assisting me all these years, and of course acknowledgement and support of the Canola Council in supporting this program. And I think their contribution and assistance in delivering the WCCRC system began in 1995, so I hope they can continue that into the future. And thank you, and that concludes my remarks.
All right, I'd like to invite all the speakers for the session back to the stage for a Q&A. So just to start things off, are there any questions from the online participants?
Okay, we've had some really good responses or really good questions from the online audience, so thank you. So the most populous question is for Alireza. What lasts longer in the field, Verticillium microsclerotia or clubroot resting spores?
That's a very good question. So for clubroot there are reports that they can stay up to 20 years, but it's very important to know that if we have that record in the literature for 20 years of resting spores being still can be viable at some portion, but almost 90% of those resting spores will be gone in 2 years. When we get back to verticillium, again, we need some more information, like solid information based on the research done in Canada. But overall, from literature from Europe, we believe that the macrosclerotia can perhaps stay in soil for 3 to 5 years, but longer reports are also can be found in literature. There is a nice work being done at the University of Manitoba, and I guess the results will be available. Part of the results are available, but we will get more results from verticillium researchers across Canada for these specific pathosystems, I guess by 2024, because the disease is still quite new disease, so most research didn't start till 2019. So we'll have more solid results on the Canadian context, perhaps 2024, but all of these numbers that I am using, mostly they come from the European literature. So overall, we can say perhaps resting spores of chlorid perhaps is hardier.
All right, thanks a lot. Are there any questions from the audience?
Hey there, I have a question for Alireza. Alireza, hey, Tyler Wist from Agriculture and Agri-Food here. You covered aster yellows for about 0.5 seconds there, and I kind of missed it at the end of your talk. Yeah. Was that 4% of all fields with aster yellows, or was that 4%?
Yeah, so we had two numbers. I guess you are right. I moved quickly. It was the last slide. So if you just look at the sites within each field we looked at, so we looked at 5 sites and 20 plants in each site, 100 plants. So if we look at just only the sites of the survey, if we found the aster yellows there, so 3.9% of the crops had aster yellows. But if we just look at the whole field, and if we found anything outside of those 5 sites, we also included, then it is 26% of the fields or crops had aster yellows.
Awesome, thanks.
So which is quite higher than even last year with 19%.
Okay, great. Let's go back to another online question.
Okay, I think this question is for Trevor, if he's still online. Okay, I'll ask it and hopefully he can respond. Okay, so what is the long-term weather outlook for the next growing season? Will canola have more favorable conditions?
Not sure if you can hear me or not. Can you respond?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. I can't answer that question. Unfortunately, we don't really have a good idea of what the seasonal forecast will be in the spring or in the summer next year. The furthest we can adequately predict is through the winter period, and typically, or for a 3-month period, and typically with our 3-month forecast, or Environment Canada's 3-month forecast, we're looking at temperatures more than precipitation. Precipitation is a little bit more unpredictable. So we're looking, the only thing I can mention is that we're looking for colder than normal winter throughout the prairies, and likely, but not 100%, more precipitation through the winter than normal. So it should improve any of the dry conditions, but again, from there on into the spring, I'm not sure.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question from the audience. And if not, maybe one more question. Oh, here we go.
We got one.
Yeah, to, I guess, anybody up there, but our pathologist expert, maybe this is directed. So of the diseases you discussed today, which one do you think is the greatest threat moving into the future for canola production, and why?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question, and perhaps it's very hard to come to one certain response to that, because Sclerotinia is moisture dependent, so it can be a yield robber, but it's very dependent on moisture. Blackleg was the disease that was least impacted by weather last year across the prairies. And I guess actually Saskatchewan was the only one who saw lower blackleg last year. Alberta, even though it was dry, even saw higher blackleg last year than previous years, and Manitoba saw quite the similar amount of disease. So it's hard disease being kind of not easily impacted by moisture. Verticillium is one that everyone is talking about, but actually we don't know much information on the Canadian context on the yield loss. University of Alberta and University of Manitoba both looking at development of yield loss model, but what we hear on 15 to 20% yield loss is from European literature, and we have the scale of 0 to 50, but 15 to 20%. And of course, chloride is a big threat always, but hopefully with stacking some resistance genes, it becomes more in control, and there are breeders and in here that can kind of add comments to that. I guess depends on the type of our management and our sustainable or integrated approach to control these diseases. One can be more important or less important. And again, that's a good opportunity to raise the importance of rotation, because rotation is the only one approach that can impact all the 4 diseases. And unfortunately, still we see in some areas, I guess vast majority of producers, they do sound rotation, but in some areas here or there, we'll see tied to almost no rotation. I've been in person for the very first time during the growing season in a field with 20 years back-to-back canola production, which we don't want to see, because then a buildup of the pathogen can happen. So I guess based on the situation, any of the disease can be a high threat or can be kind of in good management. It depends on type of operation and type of management we are going to enforce.
All right, let's thank our speakers again. And a donation has been made to the Keith Downey Undergraduate Scholarship at the U of S in lieu of speaker gifts. So thanks for all the great questions. And if you have any more questions of these speakers, I just want to remind everyone you can join on the conference app and submit questions directly to any of the speakers today.